Okay. Okay, Nixukoa. Nastuokok Natwikinatsuye. I'm Shaun Singer. I recognize a lot of my, some of my cousins and people from my Moses Lake community. You know, Moses Lake is it's God's country, come on. We even have a temple. Like, that should mean something. I want to say it's really an honor to be here and being in the presence of our elders, and I really see how lucky we still are to have them with us. I heard Geraldine speak briefly, about those concerns of loss of language. And those things have always been a concern to me. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about our identity and how in this path that I've been in the last several years has brought me to here today. Okay, hi Rod. And I want to acknowledge one of my university profs. She's here, Gloria. She has also contributed to some of the things I'll speak on today, some of my journey in the last few years of my life. I really appreciate that. So like I said, Moses Lake is like the best place in the world to be these days, right? But that's the community I'm from. And if you don't know me, I come from the Heavy Runner family and as well as a Crying Head family. My grandfather was late William Heavy Runner Sr., and Marion Crying Head was my grandmother. So being raised in our community, and if you don't know me, don't let the hair fool you. I'm half Blackfoot, obviously, but I'm also half Black and Cuban. And so that part of my life I did learn a lot about, but I could reassure you, all I know how to be is a Blackfoot person, from Moses Lake specifically. But that I'm very proud of. And because of that culture, because of having this identity, having this language, and these types of connections, have brought me to places I actually never thought I would go or have opportunities. But I'm not here today to brag about how awesome I think I am or how much education I have. I'm here to talk about us. I'm here to talk about what and who we are has brought me to where I am today. So, about 1996, just because of my own issues with illicit drugs and having my own addictions, and wanting to change my life, it started with sitting with my uncle one day, the late Wallace Mountain Horse, Sipistokosi, and having this conversation with him, and he reminded me, he didn't lecture me because of my addiction. In fact, what he did was just remind me where I come from. He reminded me that day is that, who we are as Blackfoot people. He reassured me again that I am a Blackfoot person and letting me know how important that is, that life. So he went on telling me numerous stories. I spent the day with him. I was sobbing. I was feeling guilty. I was feeling ashamed. But in the end, he gave me a sweetgrass. And he told me, Amo, use this every day. As hard as you're having it, just smudge. Just the tone of his voice, that reassurance wanted me to keep going, to change. It was never perfect. It was a rough road. But from that, I realized how fortunate I was. From that day, I realized how privileged I was. I grew up in a home, most of them Eitsi. All these old people just spoke Blackfoot to me. So growing up in this house, that's all I knew aside from going into Cardston, going to school there. So growing up learning the two languages simultaneously, which I think was really important. So it reminded me of that. It brought me back to that childhood of knowing you have in your life. And so it was very grounding. And it was very powerful that day. So moving forward, I decided around 1996, because I managed to straighten myself again, get my life together, And I started volunteering for the very new Kainai Children's Services at the time. And so I volunteered a little bit with some of the youth programs, and then eventually got a part-time job while I got back into school, right? Long story short, I've been working actively as a social worker since 1996. That's a long time. So in the last few years, I decided to go back to school. And that was in 2014. That's where I met Miss Gloria, Chief Moon. And so within this course was really important because in that course it was embedded our Blackfoot culture. Using, Western ways of thinking, Napiapi, that type of education. But it was really formulated and foundationed in our Blackfoot culture. And the nicest thing is that we actually had elders with us all the time. Having these opportunities to experience Ganotsusisin, right? To get our faces painted, all these things. It was again, I felt so privileged to be part of that. So, what I want to tell you today is why that's important. What I want to tell you is that, for me, this has been who I am. It's been how I got here. I didn't get my education, just because I'm a half Black person or I speak English. No, it's because of my Blackfoot culture and how proud I am of it, how I carry that with me all the time. So, just to give you a quick example of something, there's something really important I need to point out. I always brag about being from Moses Lake. So we always fight with cousins that live in Standoff or Laverne, and they just have this face like as if Moses Lake. All y'all Moses Lakers, you know I'm telling the truth, right? See, they're nodding their heads. The interesting thing is that in that community, growing up in there, in my generation at least, we had our grandparents or older aunts and uncles in our homes. And so having that opportunity to have these people with you, gave you access to that culture and that language and those types of connections, right? So I think the thing is that's where I say I'm very privileged, because I thought every home had that. I thought everybody had that. And I realized as I got older, not every family did. And I realized the older I got in these last few years, and this is what brought me to where I work today, was that important to make sure to reinforce not only our language, but to be able to educate people outside why our language is not spoken as often, right? I've been making note and educating outside people about our experience. Why are we here today? How we got here today. Those disconnections. So, living in a bigger city, living in the city of Calgary, educating the central government, which is our city of Calgary, teaching them about what Blackfoot identity is, why it's important. Our connections to that specific land, right? And it was always about those connections. But explaining to them is that the more and more we educate you, the more and more you have to understand why it's important that you have this level of respect, this level of understanding. You learn how to greet them. But most of all, treat us like humans. We all know what it's like. We're at home with our families, and on the reserve, everyone knows each other. We're comfortable in your skin color, your hair, the way we speak. But when we leave that place, you feel the color of your skin. Because it's the way people look at you. It's the way people treat you, right? And you feel it. They don't even have to say anything. It's just the way they look at you. And it bothers me a lot. A quick example, living here in Lethbridge for a few years and being at a light, and I saw some of our relatives cross the street. I'm not sure if they're just coming to the shelter, going to the shelter, or coming from the shelter. They're crossing the street. And I say relatives because they are our relatives. I'm not going to go and call them homeless people on the street. Those are our family, right? They're crossing the street, and this truck parking beside me, these Napiquicks. And right away, you can see them. I don't know what they were saying, but you know how we learned how to read lips? I'm just assuming what they're saying, but it's just the look on their face, the reactions. The girl pulled out her phone and started recording them because the one girl was across the street. She was dragging something. She could barely walk, and she was stumbling all over the place. I wanted to, at that moment, you have this great amount of emotion and anger run through you. It's like you want to retaliate, you want to say something. So I sat there watching this. So the girl noticed I was watching her when she turned and I pointed at her. And she put her head down. And I thought, this is just that alone. That alone, to me, is racism. There's a thing that I teach City of Calgary employees. We call it unconscious bias. You have this attitude towards something unconsciously. I mean, whether she was racist or not, but automatically she's in a judgment mode, automatically looking down on us, right? See, those things really impact me. They impact me a great deal. Anybody that's brown, right? It doesn't matter what culture, country, if they're brown and I see that, it irritates me. So I can't revert back to my old Moses Lake ways, how we dealt with things this way, right? I can't do that. But, figuring out different ways how to take action. And realizing why that's important is to educate, to have these conversations with those people. Teach them that these things are inappropriate. Teach them what it does to us, what it's been doing to us, how it's impacted us for the last 200 to 300 years. So I think I wasn't part of this conference all these past couple days, but I'm uncertain whether or not there was a conversation about the impacts of Indian residential school, the impacts of colonization, right? So these things are really real. We're still experiencing them. But I think it's important, it's how we react to them. And my presentation today was just about that. If anything that grounded me in these last few years was reconnecting with our identity. And that's why I had to take note of Gloria, and as well Betty Bastine, the late Pete Standing Alone, Andy Blackwater, and several other elders. And I really appreciate this, is because again, is helping us stay connected to who we are. And for me, that's the strength. That's the strength. So you kind of walk in life I have this attitude sometimes, I'm not afraid. Well, I'm really not. Travis knows that. But it's not because I come from Moses Lake. Well, part of it is, but not because I come from Moses Lake. But it's just being proud of the fact of that, being Niitsitapi. So today's presentation is about that. What's being a Niitsitapi? So just keep in mind and keep an open mind. We have elders here today. I'm not going to challenge them on their knowledge about what being Niitsitapi is at all, because I'm really grateful we have them. But I think that what I want to focus on was that how you reclaim it. How do you take that? How do you take it back? How do you live it? Those things, I think, are the most important part of being Niitsitapi, being a Blackfoot person. Being where I work, just as an example, for the first time in history, in the city of Calgary, we have an Indigenous Relations office. And we're almost fully autonomous, almost on our own. And because of the work that we do, they couldn't categorize us into community programs and supports. Because they realized that every one of us sitting in this office have at least the same education or more education than a lot of them. And we're all Niitsitapi. So the work that we do is very complex. And we're still building it. But it was important that they recognize this, because then now we're in intergovernmental affairs, is which they call this space. So that's an important part of this work. There's 2 of us that are Blackfoot, there's one that's Stony, there's 2 that are Snegwigs, and then there's one that's Métis. So that's another conversation about that complexity and challenge. But I want to tell you today, with our elders here, to the 2 of us that are Blackfoot, the one that's from Siksikaitsitapi, what we've been doing our best to make sure they understood the history of the land. Reassuring everybody here is that we tell them the history, the stories of that land, way before anybody showed up. It was important to connect this, not only to literature, but also to science, to prove these facts. Asking them to be aware and making sure they respect that. Our people are not coming in here trying to chase anybody out. All they're saying is respect. Respect that. So that's a little bit about me, and I just kind of want to introduce that piece because it's kind of important, so you kind of get to know how awesome Moses Lake is too at the same time. Uh-oh. Your password, somebody. I know that word.
Hey. I think that was it.
I thought your password was Little Canada.
Moses Lake.
Moses Lake.
Okay. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
I'll let you find it. There you go.
So, returning to school, having this opportunity to kind of learn from what our culture is, also learning from what our elders have to teach us. And so I kind of got to learn about what we call an ontology. And this was a really important part of, I realized, the learning. I want to share something really interesting. As we began that course, we started learning about the impacts of residential schools and how it's challenged and changed us. And so I remember Dr. Betty Bastien saying, you're going to be resistant in this course. And teaching us about some of the words. And of course, right away, my attitude was like, who's this woman to tell me, right? I'm resistant. That's really how my attitude was. Interestingly enough, I got to a point where I realized I'm being silly, being resistant, not being open. Because at the same time, I can't teach or tell my nephews and nieces, younger people in our community about this if I don't practice it. Doesn't make any sense. And I realized that's part of that resistance because I know more. Well, I know that. That's not right. We immediately have those types of reactions. Someone is speaking about a specific thing, we immediately want to dispute it. No, that's not right. No, that's not right. Because my uncle told me, right, something. Right? We have that. So that's just some of the resistance we have. The thing is that I realized we can change. It's not changing to something else, it's going back to who we are. Is reclaiming that. That is actually a really important part of what being a Nitsitapi is. So, I found this thing. I wanted to share this really quickly before I get into identity. So I realized that part of this resistance that I talk about, and you see on the screen here where it says comfort zone. And a lot of times, like until I actually saw this, I didn't realize that's where I was for a long time, many years. And I became an adult and nobody can tell me nothing, right? I make my own decisions. I decide on who I am and where I'm going, right? The biggest thing is that all these years, I began a job that challenged me to kind of step outside, giving me extra responsibilities, which I didn't feel qualified for, so I was slightly intimidated by that. I felt like I'm not educated enough for this. And I'm not going to try to do something that I'm not educated for, right? That's just how I felt at the time. I don't know what it was. And I was working at a treatment center, our treatment center. So, after being pressed several times, and I realized when I say, we're teaching this. The residents that are coming to use our services, we're teaching them this, teaching them to have this opportunity or this idea that I could move beyond this, I could get better, I could heal, right? And I realized I need some healing too, because I'm feeling a little bit fearful all of a sudden. And I couldn't figure it out. So after some pressing, I realized that I need to go back to school. I've been putting this off for too long, so I did. So that's what ventured me into this. That's what brought me here. But I realized that through this, when you look at this diagram slightly, being in a comfort zone is because you feel like, you're always in that state of your own control. Right? Family, maybe your community, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think one important part was that when I started to find out my resistance, I started to find out fears I carried, worries, and I realized it was the lacking of confidence that I could do it. That's what it was. I realized how much I take others' opinions as facts, how it controlled my life, and how I never want to step outside that space. So, after not being able to have any more excuses not to go back to school, because I try to come up with all kinds of excuses. So one of my coworkers, she kept bugging me about it. Are you going to go to school? Are you going to go back to school? Are you going to go back to school? So I did. It's like, all right, I'll do it. And that's how I met Gloria. And she interviewed me. And I was skeptical, to be honest with you, slightly excited, more fearful, because I didn't know what I was getting myself into. Either way, I made that decision. I had to follow through with it because I have an ego and I can't break it. I made that decision. I have to follow through, right? So I went ahead. So through that, you realize is that now it's new learning. New learning was really important. I realized I was a bit concerned that I'm just going to be learning about Napyapi, I guess our Western way of thinking. But I was really glad we had all of our elders part of this. It was really amazing to see some of the stuff written in Blackfoot, even though half of it I couldn't read it. right? I had to read the English. I was like, oh, okay, because I couldn't read it at the time. But it was amazing because I thought, I've never thought this would ever happen. In the 90s, when I was in university the first time, this was never part of it. Our language, you never see it as part of the curriculum. And for me, so I was a bit amazed. And so that was what intrigued me a little bit. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to try this. So I'm really grateful that I did. And as I go through this presentation, I'll explain why. Because it's really stepping outside who you are. Taking that chance to step outside who you are. Being open. Later on, I'll come back to this, but I think one thing I want to say is that if anything has actually kept me on my feet is our identity. And an identity is about who we are. It's not about a specific race. It's not our claim to our race in this modern world. It's about who we've always been. Where we come from, where we're rooted from. Our history is so enormous, it's so big. I wish I was here earlier just to hear some of the conversations from the elders, but just if you heard them speaking Blackfoot and whoever smudged this morning and did the prayer, that comes from thousands of years of knowledge. What he said or she said to you is thousands of years of knowledge. It's been here forever. When we hear sometimes, there's always a fear from our elders, like, we're going to lose our language. And they mean it. It's meaning you're going to lose it, or you're not going to use it. There's one thing I did learn from the elders before is that what is interesting about this language that we speak, and so a lot of you understand the Blackfoot language, is that it's embedded in the land that we live. It's connected to everything. There's some of you, I bought sweetgrass from this summer. Having that experience out in the land, that's our identity. That's part of our connection. So teaching our language is actually, I don't want to say it's easy. Just for the reason is that I can't say that I'm a Blackfoot teacher. I'm not going to say that. But what I can say is that I've taken from a philosophy of that language. So a lot of us, including myself, I was baptized Catholic, so a lot of us are baptized Christian in some way or another, or somebody in our family, right? So interestingly is that they always talk about these values or morals, right? You have to have values or family values. And you hear it in the news about Canadian values, right? So the other day, a couple weeks ago, I rarely watch TV, but the CTV news came on. You know those snowbirds, those planes? That was the evening news. And going on about these snowbirds and why they're important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I caught part of it I heard in my head. But I heard him say why they need to preserve this is because these are Canadian values, core Canadian values. And realizing that this is a really important part of that culture or way of thinking or being. To me, I'm just like, I don't care about these planes. Like, I don't. But that's just me, right? To me, I don't value that. I don't. Because it's a plane. And I don't know. It's this object that was built. Instead, because that same day, actually I just gotten back to my mom's in Moses Lake. I came back from Gatuyis, the Sweetgrass Hills. Being my first time ever going there. And the reason I went was because of Papokan. It was a dream. So all I knew was go leave an offering. Brought some tobacco, brought food. Made sure to ask around what the story was about Gatuyis, making sure I respected. Found out he likes fat, right? Left some tobacco. I made pemmican, etc. And I went there. And I found this place, I've never been there before, but I found this place way in the back of that mountain. It's like an opening. It's just like this meadow. And I stood there. I was nervous at the same time because it felt like somebody's watching me. You felt a presence there. And this was about 9 o'clock in the morning. So we sat down, we made our offerings, and I just sat there and prayed. And you felt the presence. And all I noticed as my eyes closed, praying, feeling the tears come down my face. Because you literally hear the grass crunching behind you and somebody walking up, standing behind you. And I just cried. I cried, but I kept praying. I have only ever heard stories about that. I've only heard people talk about going there to fast. People have received gifts there. That stunned me, but I was so amazed. But I value that because that connected me to our history, our ancestors. That's an important part of our identity. I know not everyone has those opportunities to travel to these places. I was very grateful for it. It just happened. It just happened. It wasn't planned. It just happened. So I went with it. So keep in mind, though, I really believe in atsumoiska. Sipatsumoi, our sweetgrass, our smudges, is because the last several years is all I've been using to keep myself grounded. And this world that we live in is so challenging, challenges us every day. As soon as you walk out the door, all I have is amatusman. Because that's what I value as who we are. And I know we don't have these opportunities just to run off to somewhere in the territory just to do things. There's a couple people, like I mentioned earlier, we bought sweetgrass from and some mint. And so I have to admire this, is because they spend day after day out there in the land picking sweetgrass. And for whether or not they've probably, well, I bought it from them, and I appreciate it, and I trusted them, right? Because they come back clean, they're organized, done really well, and I appreciate it. And I got them from my mom. But I have to admire that about them is because they spend all that day connected to the land. We may think differently of them. We may think that they're using it maliciously or just using it to make money. But I have to admire them because they take the time to spend out there in that land. What I experienced at Gatuis at Sweetgrass Hills, I could only imagine what they experience when they're out there picking our medicines. It's that connection. And that's our identity, right? That was a really quick part of what I wanted to talk about. And being Nitsitapi is really about this ontology, this value system, how it connects us, and why it's important, and even in the work that I do today. So we hear a lot about values in our community, but in ontology, it's just a way of being. It's our reality, reality. The more and more that I've done research, the more and more I look at our culture, look at our language, having these conversations with elders, it's interesting is that, you know what, the basic English that we use to translate our language doesn't suffice, it doesn't work. Because Nitsitapi, you can't just say it's a value, a way of being. You can't. It's way more than that. It's way more sophisticated, to be honest with you. It's complex, and it's very important. So it's easier, and this is what I've learned going to school about an ontology. Because it may be philosophical, it's science-based, but it's reality. it's real. They're real things. So there's one word, and we call them responsibilities. We always hear this, right? Gimmapi bitsini. And our elders will always say that. They'll tell us. We hear this often, right? We hear it all the time. And in fact, have you ever heard like your older cousin? They're trying to guilt you. You're supposed to have gimmabibitsin, but they don't actually have gimmabibitsin, but they make you have gimmabibitsin. I've been in a lot of those situations. Got suckered out of money and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, gimmabibitsin is a really important thing. And I've heard it defined as to have compassion. Compassion is another value, right? Value of the Western world, to have compassion. It just says to have it, right? It's up to you whether you want it. To us, how I understood it makes sense is because when the elder teaches you stuff, right? Gives you something, sits you aside, tells you a story, shares something with you, funny, gives you that time, acknowledges you. It's kindness. It's to be kind, right? It's more than just to have compassion. You have to have empathy. Like you have to understand what a person's actually going through. Our community, those connections. It's more than just compassion. It's having an ability. Every one of us has this ability. It's an ability, it's reality, it's real. We actually do it. It's not about just posting it somewhere, right? We'll have compassion, right? So going to social work school, or school for social work, we learn about ethics, right? And a lot of ethics are really formulated kind of loosely, I would say, in Indigenous ontology. But I say loosely is because it tells you to have. It doesn't encourage you just to be. Those are different things, right? Because you gotta be. Because it's real, who we are. You guys all know who you are. We all know where we're from. We all know where Kainai is, Siksikaitsitapi. We know all these places. We know this, right? But for some reason, we seem to be like disconnected from it when we're actually of it. We are it. We are that, right? Those are those important connections. So the thing about our value system was where it's important is sometimes we always refer it just about having, like just to care. But it's kind of more than that. It's because we identify with each other, we connect with each other, our communities, our relatives, our families, our clans, our bands, our history, the different names, our Blackfoot names, our nicknames. You know, it's about how we see each other, those connections, why they're important. It's really about connecting us to who we are. So when I said, I'm not sure earlier today, if any conversation was about impacts of Indian residential school. But the thing is, we have to acknowledge that we are disconnected a little bit from who we are. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not consequencing anyone from it. But it's just that we just acknowledge that we are. It's not that you have to be perfect. We don't have to be ashamed of it. But it's just acknowledging why we are. Why we've become that disconnection. So when I said earlier that I was so privileged to grow up and having elders in my life, and Rodney being one of them, being privileged to have this, I realize is that not everyone does. And I realize is that wherever I've worked, places I've been, there's always a lack of support for us. There's always that challenge. There's always that fear of us. And I, oh, okay. It's kind of like, do we have to run? Right. All right. See how colonized you guys all are? You guys are all looking at your phones. So, I know our reality today is that we do live in this modern world. I get that. And we have to work. We have to do things. We need money to buy stuff, to eat, all of these things. And sometimes those, even just those things are hard for our people to obtain, to connect, to get, and challenged by a whole bunch of other things, right? That's hard. And I'm not going to say it's easy, right, at all. I see how privileged I am. I do, and I understand it. I see the community I come from, the challenges that exist in my community, right? And some of the families, because some of them are my family, some of them are my relatives. So I get it. And I'll never put myself above that. You know, when I said earlier, I'm not going to sit down here and brag about how much education, who I am. It's about us. And it's really about this identity, what we call ourselves, right? And I think that's important for everyone, you know, just to think about when we hear our elders have those conversations with us, is gyakisti. You listen, just hear them. Just really take it and understand it. Not as a lecture, but it's just that there's always something interesting in what they have to say. So we always use this, and it's always something we automatically know. Espamutisni, how we help each other, right? So from what I understood, I believe, I'm not sure if it's Blood Tribe Health or Wellness Centre specifically, on their website, they have these values actually listed in there, right? And I think that's really important. Some of the stuff that I'm using today is actually from Red Crow College. They're really important. And I'm going to tell you why they're so important. So when I went to school to do my bachelor degree in social work, and this was University of Calgary, there is a class you have to take. Social work theories, right? Theory. And this big, thick book on all these theories, which the majority of these people were theorists. There's Napikwan that probably died 100 years ago, right? But they're telling you how you help people that are underprivileged, like the poorer population. These people who are like middle class. Telling us how to help somebody who's not as rich as they are. I see so many issues with that. Like, I'm going to write a paper on this, right? I'm going to write a paper on how I think I should help my community through this. Oh yeah, excuse me if I accidentally swear, don't mean to. Okay, I'm just gonna say up front. I did that a couple times at this one presentation, I didn't realize it. Anyway, I'm not gonna swear. But I'll say BS, because I felt a lot of that stuff was. Because it had nothing to do with who we are, what we experience, what some of us see in our communities. Right? It doesn't help us anyway, in any way. And there is one theory in there, it's called Aboriginal theory. Aboriginal theory is based on a medicine wheel. Not saying that it's wrong, but as far as I understood from some of the elders that told me, that actually doesn't necessarily belong to Blackfoot culture, from what I understood traditionally. There was a different way of being we had. And it wasn't creating some kind of circle and divide us up into 4 parts, right? Because this value system doesn't work that way. You can't divide it because it's related, it's interrelated, and always connected. You can't just break up that circle of people and groups and tribes and how we've always been. So I couldn't use it. I couldn't use it because it did not make sense. So I argued with the professors. I insisted that in part of the university is supposed to ensure that I have this quality education. Kainai is paying you guys a stupid amount of money for me to be here, so I need to make sure that my education is where I needed it. So I insisted. There is no proper literature out there that I could use. So I argued to use Betty Bastien's book, Blackfoot Ways of Knowing. So I took that book, I took everything I can out of it about this value system, how it connects us in our communities to our lands, to our history, to our ancestors, but also as well as the future, while all of us being present. Teaching about what the ancestors have passed down, the story of Katuyis, which I needed to go ask about, that is like our ancestors basically leapfrogging through time and still here with us today. Because we ask, "Natutsi kokomiki sum ibisawatsi baksi ibisawatsi." You hear our elders calling them. These are our ancestors. So this paper was written. This paper was written arguing these theories. And I thought, I don't care if I fail. It's got it done. Sent it in. And I was really expecting some pushback. I got my paper back, I got an A. Just for the reason is that they couldn't argue this, is because the professor said that as much as he's been working in the university for the last 30 years, he doesn't know enough of Indigenous or Blackfoot culture to even make this argument, and that was the best written paper he's ever written because he actually learned something. Because he didn't know that. I live next to the Blackfoot people, I didn't even know that. It's not a brag about me. It's about our culture. That's how powerful our culture is. When you tell it. Because we tell stories, right? We're always sitting sharing stories. We pass knowledge. And that was what was really important about that paper. Because I was really arguing these facts, is that we have a lot of challenges in our community. Addictions, we have violence, there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of these things that we don't have access to. And there's a lot of internal battles. You know, we get upset with our leaders because they can't do certain things. We blame them. Like, it's interesting is that somehow along the way, this Western culture taught us to be like that, to blame others because we don't have something, right? But we put pressures on our leaders and blame them. Oh, they just stole money. I see them drove by in a brand new truck, right? I don't think it's about that, but I realize that how broken sometimes we kind of are. And I get it, and I understand, and I'm sure our leaders understand that. Those are the challenges. Those are things that we face. And I know that there's no easy remedy. There isn't any easy remedy. However, I realize my responsibilities. I realized what my responsibilities are, saying I'm going to want to be a social worker. But it's more than that. I have a responsibility to our community. I'm a member of our community. And my responsibility is I need to also help. I wish I had like millions of dollars to hand out, make everybody's, issues go away. I wish it was that easy, but could you imagine if that happened? Somebody gave everybody $1 million, right? Just imagine what that would be like. Wouldn't that be awesome? Pay up all your bills, buy that really awesome vehicle you wanted, travel, do all these things. You're just like an Instagram star all of a sudden, you're on TikTok, right? You're just glamorous clothes, walking around with all this stuff, right? Wouldn't that be wicked? But would it fix our issues, though? Right? Would it fix our issues? Would it fix that pain that I have here? Would it fix that disconnection that I have, though? That's the thing, right? Is this thinking about that, how we're disconnected. And I worry sometimes that, like, what if we did? What if we hit the jackpot, right? You know, we'd have this I mean, I'll be happy for our community, especially our elders. There's a lot of families out there that really need this. I'd be so happy for them. I would be. But at the same time, I would worry too, right? I would worry too. I'm always an optimistic person. I'm always going to believe in who we are. It's not about how much education one has or one doesn't, how much knowledge one has or one doesn't, but I always have to believe in who we are. Because doing that is also part of helping to keep that belief, that understanding of who we are. So, some of you, I want to ask, what is it to be Nitsitapi? What is it to be Blackfoot? Oh yeah, I hope you're taking notes because there's a test after. You can't get anything until you finish the test. Kidding. A lot of us, sometimes when we talk about this, I've had conversations over the last few years, and when you talk about what it is to be Nitsitapi. I was at Akukatsen a couple years ago, and there was kind of a little, this was before the summer before the COVID-19. And so I sat just observing some people, and so there was a kind of a little bit of an argument between two guys. And the one guy was upset with the other guy because of this hat or something he was wearing, and then went over there and ripped it off his head and getting mad at him. And then the other guy got upset, why'd you do that? He said, well, we're Nitsitapi, we don't do this. Like wear the hat, because it was like a cowboy, I don't know, some kind of hat. Anyways, but I observed from a distance, none of my business, I wasn't gonna get myself involved, and I won't even mention who it is. But what I thought made me think though, what is it to be Nitsitapi? What does that actually mean? So I asked, what does this mean? They're like, well, we're the original people. We were first here. And I can't argue that. Like, I agree with that. I feel that here. But I didn't feel I could fully say I am for some reason, because I started to think more and more about what it is in those connections, right? How we are Nitsitapi. How did we become? I started to think about, I had conversations with Dwayne Mistaken Chief. So he's like a linguist. And so we're breaking down the language a little bit. Origins, what it means, where it came from. These constructs. And I thought it was interesting to hear him say, you know, sometimes you have to always think about, you know, where we come from, the land we're connected from, the history we come from, our main food sources we had in history. Why we say ni, e, right? E, ni, like kind of thing. And I thought, what? I never even thought of it that way, right? He's like, you know, it's one of our main food sources, e, ni. One of them. We ate different animals, but that was one of our main ones. And he said, when we say ni, it's something real. Ni is something real. It means it's sincere, it's true, it's truth. And I thought, wait a second. Nitsitapi, in a broader sense, means to have integrity. When I walk, well, I'm not going to walk around and preach to people and say, hey, you have to have Gimabibitsin, you know? I have cousins that do that, by the way, but I can't preach that to people and tell them you have to have this, right? We hear our elders always tell us why it's important Why Gimmabibits is important, Espomotsis is important, and Nakamotsis is important, etc. There's several of them. And I realized rather than just walking around preaching them, you actually have to live them. And I realized if I live them, through them, we have integrity. I see that of our elders. I respect that a lot. Is to have that kind of integrity. And I think the Western world's kind of taught us a little bit about being disconnected from that. Making it like we can't achieve it. Our ontology, our way of being, our Blackfoot way of being, these are just some. There's several others. The Western world has really challenged us, kind of taken these pieces from us, right? It's really taken away who we really are. There's some of you in the room are fluent. There's a couple of these guys back there, especially that row right there, those guys. They're from God's country, where I'm from. And they're fluent. And, the thing I will respect about this is because, when you sit and have these conversations with them, they really come from this really sincere place in the way they speak the language. Even if it's a joke, challenge, they talk about how they walked from A to B, how hot the sun was that day, and challenging where they went to go pick their medicines, right? That's awesome. For me, that was something that made me really rethink why those things are so important. Because they're not walking around preaching the value, they're just living it. And I respect that. I'll respect you for that always, you guys, for doing that for me. And I think that's a really important part, and I think that's what our elders always tell us to be, how to be. Trying to encourage us to make sure that we live through them. Today's presentation is not enough time to go through all of them. And 3 years ago, I taught a Blackfoot language and philosophy course for social work students specifically, and it was really based on this value system. Having guidance with elders was also really important is because some of our traditional stories were part of this system. And what it is to be a Blackfoot. And the most important part of that course was that if they want to be a social worker in our community, you need to learn this. You need to have that type of empathy and concern and understanding that we are going to help our community without expectation of a reward, right? To get back something. Because that's how we're supposed to help each other, right? We just give, we help. You don't expect anything. And that's just how we're supposed to be, right? I know we've moved, over time, we've moved kind of far past these things, these ideas. But I think what is really important is that you are all here. You are all here to this day. We still exist. It doesn't matter how much you know the language. It doesn't matter how much you understand the culture, the stories. The most important part is that how and why we're still here. Because of being Nitsitapi, because of this ontology, because of these stories, because of our guidance, because of Atsumoiskan, this is what has brought us here today. And when saying Atsumoiskan, I've really come to understand this greater as well. This is important, and I always have to credit Betty Bastine for this, is really understand when you listen. Did you listen to the elder praying today? I wasn't here. But I bet you the elder acknowledges our celestial beings, our ancestors. Natusi, Bisawasi, Waxi Bisawasi. We have stories of them, calling them to guide us through today. That we come here with a good heart, good way of thinking, brought us here today to make sure that everything that's said here is done in respectful ways. People are not feeling well. praying for them. They're praying for somebody over in the community. Something was happening over here, praying for people traveling, praying for people, going back home after the conference. Praying for all of you, that you absorb this knowledge. Praying for things for us, for good in front of us in our paths, right? And what is interesting, though, is that we want to say immediately, praying, right? When really our elders are asking for us to maintain good relations with each other, with the land. It's really incredible when we actually look at the language that way. When you look at it for what it's actually doing for us, because that language is alive all the time. And that's what connects us, and that's what comes from our history. That comes from our past, but it's always still very present with us. I wanted to add that, by the way, what time is it? 20 after 2. I'm really uncertain how long you wanted me to go, because we're going to do an interpretive dance. Travis is going to help me. So yes, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I'll just kind of finish off this presentation, but I just wanted to kind of give you guys that portion of it. Thanks. I wanted to share a little bit of something, just in part of this journey, right? And this is a really important part of a lot of this work. And for the last few years, I think it's really important for community. So along this journey, and so earlier in this previous presentation was really about our Nititipi way of life, our ontology. I needed to say this to you, right? So you get an idea of where I'm coming from, but what actually I'm talking about, because that value system or that these ways of knowing are a really important part of not only just my life, but all of our lives and the future of our people. So nowadays, we've become really comfortable, I guess you could say, in some ways. It's understanding all these new genders, pronouns, and understanding what that all means. In the last 5 years, is being asked by people, community, our boards of education, is like, what does this mean in Blackfoot, right? So back in, Gloria witnessed this actually, back in 2015, I believe it was that INU course, right? So in part of my social work research, you have to find, we were given a task of choosing a social issue in our community. And we given a list of social issues, and all of the ones are very obvious. The obvious ones are poverty, the violence, the addictions, housing, all these challenges that we experience. On the very bottom of that list, because I knew everyone was choosing the same things, because then we have to present this. You have to go to an elder, ask a couple questions on how this issue would have been dealt with prior to us being colonized. So rather than presenting what somebody else is going to be presenting anyways, right? So at the bottom of the list, there was a word called heterosexism. I was like, I'll choose this one. I didn't even know what it meant. I just I'll take that one, right? Just something to do. Anyway, it turns out it was a little bit more challenging than I actually thought. Just for the reason, it's just that this is an attitude of men or males. Anyone, female, anyone that is not a, I guess you would say, hyper-masculine man is weaker than them. And that's an attitude, it's a behavior, and it's toxic, actually. So I went to sit with a couple elders asking about this and trying to be respectful. I practiced trying to say this in Blackfoot. Could you imagine trying to say heterosexism in Blackfoot? Oh my God. But anyway, so I sat with him, we had this long conversation, I was trying to explain it to him in Blackfoot, and he told me, I do speak English, and I do understand English, but it was just doing it in a respectful way, approaching our elders in that way and respecting them. The reason is as much as I think English, and especially academic or scientific English, better captures our way of knowing. But sometimes that language, too, when we speak to our elders, could be condescending and it could be talking down. That was why I approached them the best way I could in Blackfoot. Okay, so I just out of respect for them. And that was the reason for it. And it was good practice, right? Anyway, so we also were encouraged to be creative, people to do art, poetry, music, whatever it is, just to kind of, to present some of what you've learned. So while I was visiting, this was Red Crow College, the old building, and I sat in the library kind of looking at books, trying to find stuff. So I came across, Mary Weaselfat, the librarian. She has this big metal safe with all these rare books, right? And it was open. No one can touch them. But, she was my friend. I was like, can I, dig around in there? She's like, yes, just don't let them leave. So I went through a lot of the stuff that was in that cabinet. And they had collected a lot of rare books and even documents. And so in there was actually these things they call occasional papers. They were from the Glenbow Museum. There's a man named Claude E. Schaefer. And so what I guess you can describe was probably an anthropologist. But a lot of these writings, these occasional papers, were observations. Like they're watching what we're doing and they're writing about it, right? Basically word for word. Even if they don't understand what we're doing, they're writing down what they're observing of us. One of these documents was called Blackfoot Shaking Tent. And I thought, Blackfoot Shaking Tent? I've never heard of it. I thought it was only Sina, the Cree, that did that ceremony, and this is Blackfoot. So I had to read it. I didn't know this. I didn't know our Blackfoot people had been doing this for a long time, like a very long time. And it was last done, was ever performed by a Blackfoot person was about 100 years ago. A little more than 100 years ago. And of course we wouldn't know, right? Indian residential school was at its prime in the early 1900s, industrial schools, and eventually Indian residential schools. And of course, that really turned and changed who we are. So why this is really significant, although I think ceremony is very significant, a certain practice, a way we heal, those are very, very important to me and should be for all of us. But what was really interesting, though, was that there was this person, specific person, named Bikanaki, pagan woman, who performed shaking tent from the Bloods. And shaking tent, at the time, was the ceremony that was looked to by our elders and our leaders because they bring the spirits in the ceremony. And that chief at the time had lost something and asked that pagan woman for his ceremony to be able to find this lost article. So the guy, Claude E. Schaefer, that wrote this, described pagan woman as a transvestite, a man wearing a dress. And it was a very short part, but I didn't care. I didn't care that it was short. I didn't care he called him transvestite. I just thought, wait a second. I didn't know this. I didn't know about this. Because then all of a sudden this became important. So I needed to do more research. I needed to find out more about who this person was, what this ceremony was about. And just so happened, within about 2 months from that moment, I was introduced to this man through my family. His name is Kirby Littletent, Senakwan. And I had a relative that was very, very sick. She had cancer. And so we ended up in the shaking tent, this ceremony. And I'll be honest with you, I was scared. Because that fear we have about Crees, right? That was why I was scared, because I thought, what if or something, I don't know why I was thinking that, but I have cousins who are Cree, and I don't know why I was thinking that. But anyway, that was most amazing thing I ever experienced in my life. I never knew about this. Never knew this even existed. I just heard about it. I just never experienced it. So I was actually in this ceremony. And that one of those spirits that came in is Eagle Pita. And it shocked me, speaking in the Cree language, but then he turned to English, started speaking English. And one of the people in the room that was from back home, he was calling her out because of her gambling. He was teasing her about bingo, and he started singing that bingo song or something. And it's what made it real. Like, it really made it real for me. I mean, it's not that I don't believe in that, but it's just that was incredible. So having firsthand experienced the ceremony, right? So I needed to understand, who is this pagan woman? So I started sitting with elders who I think would know about these ceremonies, asking questions. I really spent that time just really looking and understanding what this connection's all about. So eventually, part of my presentation, because I kind of got a little bit of knowledge about it and sat with a couple elders, and then finding out that this behavior, this attitude, at a time before Napikwexi Duya, if you treated a person like that in the wrong way, you spoke against them, well, there was rules in the community. And then if you were exiled from that band for doing that such behavior against women, children, the elderly, they chase you away. And if you're out there roaming, right, between the different bands and clans, they're going to question, why are you roaming around alone? You did something, right? You can't hide what you did because they're going to question it, because people traveled a certain way, a lot of times in pairs or groups between the different bands and clans, according to what the elder told me. So I began to present this in class. And then I began presenting. So in the class, we had the whole group. It was our community presentations. In the back of the room, see, when I did a presentation today, for example, when we have elders, when I had said already, like, I'm never going to challenge their knowledge or anything. I'm always going to be respectful of them. And I'm always going to be ready to be corrected, because I never want to misrepresent who we are. And I never want to be the expert, the one that, I know everything about us as Blackfoot. Never want to do that. So doing this presentation, I was extra nervous because Minit Puka was sitting in the back of the room. Peter was amongst it. I was really nervous. I thought, okay, I better, make sure I say this correctly, right? So part of my presentation, I asked around on Facebook, I found a mannequin. And I thought, because I experienced the ceremony, these spirits coming in, lighting up, talking to us. To me, those are our ancestors, right? I have a cousin who does sweats and night lodges too. That's the same thing. My late uncle, Buster Yellow Kidney, did the same thing. And they bring these spirits in and we experience them, right? And to me, those are ancestors, right? We literally have a way to talk to our ancestors, right? And that's how I experienced Shaking Tent. So I thought, let's bring pagan woman. Let's bring pagan woman. So I got a mannequin, and I thought, if pagan woman showed up today, he'll see all these ladies really dressed in their ribbon dresses, all this nice stuff, and right away, pagan was, we don't want that. It's not going to want to wear his old stuff. Like, no, I want, make something nice, right? That's just how for some reason I thought. So I made everything. I arrived to class early and I had this black cloth over it, put it in the front of the room. Everyone was curious about what that was. Like, what's that, right? So I was about the fifth person to do my presentation. So I presented heterosexism, those challenges, what the elder told me, kind of sped through it, right? Because I needed to because everyone's just focused on this mannequin that's covered, right? No one's even looking at me when I was talking. They were looking at that mannequin, right? So I asked everyone if they've ever experienced some kind of ceremonies. Most people said yeah. And I asked them all to shut their eyes. And I had rattles. I made these rattles with deer hoofs. That in itself is another story. I don't even know why, but I didn't know it was actually part of the ceremony, but I made it. And so I put it there, made another rattle, and I started shaking them. And I told everyone to close your eyes. Imagine you hear this, and all of a sudden you open your eyes. And I pulled that cloth off, right? And I told everyone to open their eyes. And then just the look on everyone's face, seeing this mannequin in this dress. And it's a man, really tall, big, but in a dress, right? I had to try to capture the height of this person. What I enjoyed was watching everyone's reaction. The only person in the room that didn't close their eyes was Mini Buka, who was sitting in the back. He was on the edge of his seat, just looking at me, right? I thought, geez, please don't let me screw this up. So I presented Pagan Woman. I explained what Shaking Tent was, who this person was, and then just asking everyone, imagine what that would have been for us before we had been impacted by Christian way of thinking. Imagine what kind of community we were, because this is a person, a spiritual leader in our community. We never looked at him because he's a man wearing a dress. This is a spiritual leader that we go to that doctors us back to health. So the premise of that was presenting it and just some of the stuff I knew. And every time I end a presentation, I say, Gan, before anybody could react, Minit Buka, Kika, Kika, Kika. He jumped up, and I thought, oh no, I'm going to get corrected. That's how I felt. So standing in front of him, he came around, and then he stood between me and that mannequin. And just his presence, I thought, oh no, I said something, might have missaid something, right? So I was ready. I was ready to be corrected. And he said, nah, points at me. Na niskana. Nani ihte pui. Imani. It just shocked me. I was like, what? Really? I was kind of happy but shocked. And he said, what he said is right. And he said, he pointed at that mannequin and said, if it wasn't for them, there'll be no such thing as Blackfoot people. And he said, I'll tell you why. So he began going on the story of Katuyis, blood clot. He began telling the story. I don't have enough time to tell you guys the whole story if you don't know it, but the story of blood clot, right? The moral of the story is blood clot became a boy or a child. And in that, he was going to be killed had he been a male. And so Peter goes on to explain was that this child, as an infant, had an ability to talk. He had supernatural powers. He needed to grow. But in order for him, he needed assistance of that old couple, right? Because they needed to help him move his body around because he is going to transform into a girl, which he did. And by the time the other person came, they were going to kill him, it had to be a boy, and viewed Gatuyis as a girl and left him alone. And eventually Gatuyis grew up. There's a bigger story about this. I encourage you guys all to sit with elders and ask them about the story. It's really amazing. So Peter goes on to say is that he had that child survived. That child survived. That child came here from the cosmos. That child had supernatural power. That child had the ability to cross between genders. That child was one of the first two spirit people in this world, and had he had died, none of us would be sitting here today. We owe our lives to them. Then he turns to me and said, Skani, sukat me, and hugged me. I was almost in tears. I didn't expect that. That was the last thing I thought, Minit Buka would say. Not to say that he doesn't have knowledge, but I didn't, because I know him personally. And I didn't expect him to say that. I didn't even expect to do that presentation. That was not even what I was planning. It just happened. It happened for whatever reason. Because all I said when I started this path is I'm going to focus on Amatut Siman, Hatsumoiskan, and allow that to guide me. And all of a sudden, I'm doing this. All of a sudden, I have, been, and after that, it just went one after another doing this presentation. So I got very keen, just knowing the fact that this was really well received. And it was received by our community, by institutions, because then now they're wanting to know more. So I had to start reading. I had to start digging out stuff. I need to look for stuff. So when you go in the library, even in the online library, you can put in a Blackfoot Two-Spirit person. You won't really find anything. I had to read a lot of stuff. And I found stuff eventually. I started finding articles, finding stuff of people that were here around earlier 1900s, watching what we are doing. And all of a sudden, these people started popping up. There was more of them. I came across Matsunui, tongue eater, a warrior from Siksika, singing bird, forebears, running eagle. And with that, because they couldn't write our language very well, they started writing gender names to these people, but in kind of really a phonetical, rough way. And then finding out from the different 4 tribes, from each of them, what those gender names mean. So this, of course, I'm locked out again. So over the years, I'll need your password. Is it still Hollywood's nightclub?
Hotmail. M-A-L-E. It's wellness.
Jesse's. Do you remember that place?
If you didn't, if you needed this, capital
Cole Banks? Jokes.
W.
Let me just already put it in. Presentation. So, for the next few years, after discovering these, I call them Blackfoot historical figures, because these are people of our past. So, according to this occasional paper, pagan woman was around 1850. Matsunoi and singing bird, which became a couple, they're around early 1800s. So this is predating our residential schools. And I was blown away because I never knew this. I was finding it from these observation papers, how they were observing us, how these people were coming into our communities and all the bands, all the Blackfoot tribes, and watching what we're doing and how we interact with each other and what our genders are. And so, of course, to them, some of this was a bit unusual, right? And it's the way they write about it. So as the years went on, and so I finished, got my bachelor's degree in social work, then I immediately started a master's degree in education. And so my research continued. I kept doing presentations everywhere. So I made all of them, pagan woman, Matsunui, tongue eater, and her partner, singing bird, and as well as running eagle. So I was doing these presentations, and so it eventually caught on with Southern Alberta Arts, and so eventually the Galt Museum obtained them for an entire year. So we had an exhibit here in Lethbridge for an entire year for these. They were just mannequins, but it's just describing who they were. So while they were, I couldn't access them for a while, but while they were there, I was able just to go there and take photographs of them. So during my master's work, we do our final capstone project, right? And so I had to present all my findings. I had to kind of come from a perspective of understanding, what our genders actually meant. I had to sit with, of course, sat with my mom, I sat with elders that I did know, having conversations. And Mini Buka has been that person that's been on me about this. And every time I see him, okay, it's gonna, anyways, where are you with this stuff? Are you still doing it? You better keep it going. He keeps pushing me. It's important because Nuko Sinnan, they need to know. Our community needs to know, right? So it's like, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. So my mom, this became a really big thing for her, understanding this. The first mannequin I created, she kind of took it. And she said I can borrow it if I needed it. And it sat in her living room because this was something really significant to her. And I appreciated that, having that level of support, especially for my mom. She's very hardcore Catholic. But to have that level of support, that's important. One day, visiting my mom, I had an older relative come. And he showed up out of the blue, and he came in and we said hi. Then he saw in the living room, he pointed at that mannequin. He said, "What's that? What's this all about?" Right? So I began trying to explain it to him, what I was doing, and in the end, why mom took it. He sat there looking at it for a long time, and then he said, "Well, it's time for you to know." And I was like, "No, what?" He said, "You were still a little kid." He said, "All those old people you're around, they are always talking about you and who you were going to be. One day you were going to do this." And he said, "So now I have to tell you the story of these people," which he called Natikapustumik. And he said, "This is what they talked about all the time." And they said, "That's who you were." And they said, "Someday in the future, you're going to grow up and you're going to talk about this." And I was really shocked to hear this. I mean, this guy, I never even, if you know him, he's always constantly joking around and, says some borderline things you shouldn't say. But it shocked me, just his level of knowledge about this. Then he began explaining to me the story of why they have this name. I'll tell you the quick version of it. Prior to a time we had the Canada-US border, one of our people was escaping these earlier settlers going through the western United States. They're trying to capture him. And he ran, they shot at him. They severely injured him, but he made it back. Being severely injured, bleeding, very ill from it. He just came across this person. And what the elders apparently said, this is a person, Asuki Neki. And this person doctored him and described in the story was describing whatever abilities or powers he had, he took out all of these bullets or whatever they were that impaled him with whatever powers he had, because he was laying on the ground bleeding to death, and repaired him. That man went on to live, to tell the story of Natikapustomi, these people that had a duality, and went on to tell more stories that was important that we make sure we understand and understanding them, right? So that's where this word comes from. And there's a couple people that kind of disputed it a little bit, which is fine. I'm just going on based on the story. And this is what we've been just kind of trying to use, okay? So my capstone presentation was really about, the goal of this was to have this published, was be able to create a booklet for us to use that ontology, Gimmapi Bitsen, understanding that through our genders. And interestingly was that it's kind of strange. I'm going to verify still with elders. I'm going to skip through some of this because it's just part of my the capstone project. So this work was going to be published to help us understand how we use those values through the genders. We have genders of male, we have a gender of female, we have a gender with male to female, female to male, a gay person, a lesbian person, and a person who's bisexual. So I didn't know what all this was, right? I didn't know there were specific terms for them. All of a sudden, a cousin, cousins stop in to borrow money. They tell you a big long story, and then they tell you if you can loan them $40. She showed up. So anyways, we ended up talking, and I told her, remember that? She was asking about what I was doing. I told her. She's like, remember that story Grandma told us? That Grandma, my late aunt, Inaka, she told this story about Awawaki. And she told this story about, at a time, it was her aunt taking care of a child. Taking care of a child because her own children didn't want to take care of this kid. They were ashamed of it. And she was taking care of this baby. And the old lady, her aunt, was very old and asked my aunt to help her change the diaper. And then finding out that this was a boy, but it had female genitalia. There used to be a word we describe in English, like they call them hermaphrodite. We don't use that term anymore. But that was what she was describing. And that's what that old lady said. This is what we call awuwaki because it's a male body with female genitalia. That this was used to always happen in time, right? And these were specific people that came throughout time. It wasn't just an accident, right? These were individuals. This was a gender. So we sat there and had this long conversation. I was really blown away. I was like, I forgot about that. I forgot she said this story, right? I just completely missed my, thoughts at the time. But it didn't stop because more came. There was more stuff started showing up all of a sudden. So having a conversation with, as I was doing this work, there was a couple students that were doing their bachelor and a master's degree. So they heard that I was doing this stuff, and so interviewing me, had conversations. One of them was, I think he's in anthropology, I believe it is. So they were doing a lot of work out at Esinabi, the riding on Stone Park. And so they came across these effigies, and these effigies were really, really different from everything else. And so they were trying to track, and of course he was going to elders trying to understand what those specific effigies, because they're different from everything else. Because what those effigies were showing was that this is a dual person, right? It's not a male or female. It seems to be a blend of one or the other. And there was 3 of them. So he began asking elders, and so he went to see another elder about it, and the elder explained, one of these, what he remembered was, what he described was that there was this like a female-bodied person with male genitalia, kind of. So it's kind of the opposite of like awuwaki, right? Anyway, so it turns out that I started to find out from Skapi Pikani what they would call a gay person, a gay male, is akina. One of those things I came across with those people recording what those old people were describing, they gave what we call nowadays a lesbian person. They would give them 2 ways of describing. It's either ninawaki or ninaki. And this word was kind of disputed with me. That's why I said there was people that disputed it. It's because that's the term we use for women chief or leader. All right? But in that, they're describing Running Eagle as her gender because she had a same-sex partner. She had a wife. And she was a warrior, right? And so that was where this was interesting. That's how I, coming across a lot of what we describe as gender. And this is really different for us because we only know man and woman, right? We've heard that all our lives, man or woman. In the Western way of describing a gender, they just have that really specific answer, man or woman. And within those genders, there's specific roles assigned to them and as a behavior and how they should be, right? Just to those 2. If you have to be one or the other, right? It's very rigid. But for some reason, back in the 1800s, these were these people in our community, right? Nobody questioned it. But we question it now just because of Christianity. And please, don't be offended by some of the stuff as I refer to Christianity. It's not knocking it. It's just a difference of understanding and value. Because we, in some way, I know I am, but I don't practice it. I'm the worst Catholic out there, so I don't even know enough about it. But the most important thing with this was that it was really trying to help people understand what gender identity is when it comes to Blackfoot people. So in general, in 1990, they came up with this idea, all these different tribes have a name for all these different genders. Because in some of the Sioux, south of us, they also have very specific gender names, describing pretty much the same, almost the same people. And same with the Cheyenne, the Crees, north of us and east of us, right? All these people around us had these descriptions except us for some reason because I couldn't find it. Because I kept getting asked this question. I was like, I don't know. Like, only terms I ever grew up learning was that awakiskasi or anaskasi. That's how they described. But they're derogatory terms. That's not proper description. But in these terms, if you really think about it, there's a story one of the elders always talks about. There's always this mystery of 7. It's like a sequence, 7. This number was really an important thing about who we were as Blackfoot. It's a mystery, it hasn't been solved, but it's significant to who we are. And while I was doing this work, I was working with Travis Plated Hair. He was my boss at the Friendship Center. So we had a youth group. So we were trying to do getting our urban kids connected to the Blackfoot culture. So we came up with 7 stars. The Big Dipper, basically, story. And Minipuka came, transferred the name to us, and so that was what we're using, 7 Stars Youth Society. And so we started creating programs for kids in town, connecting them to elders, ceremony, etc., right? But this sequence of 7 kept repeating itself everywhere, right? It started to be really interesting when the more and more I heard the story of the 7 stars, the Big Dipper, those 7 boys. Different elders have different interpretations of it. They tell their own versions of it. Some will actually break it down a little bit, explaining that, well, those boys weren't heroes because, they were treating this girl, their sister, kind of pushing her aside, didn't give her an equal opportunity. And in the end, this was the consequences because they put her in so much emotional distress. She lost herself in a way, distracted because she was wanting some companionship, somebody to pay attention to her, listen to her, because they left her every day. Then finally, when somebody came to her life, then they acted, right? But she was blinded by this, right? And then they eventually ascended into the sky, which became the Big Dipper. That's the quick version of it if you don't know the story. But interestingly, Leo, of that story, the girl is always left to be the floozy, right? I know, she's the one who ducky, or, they blame her. She didn't even do anything wrong, if you think about it. Like, what did she do wrong? What responsibilities did those boys have? There's 7 of them, and there's 1 of her, right? And she's the blame for everything. Teaching this to kids was important, explaining our roles and responsibilities. It's interesting how today we still haven't continued to learn from that, right? And what's happening to our women today? All nititapiakiks. How they're missing, murdered, abused. We still experience this in our communities, right? And that was what we were reinforcing with these kids. How not to treat women, girls. Treat them with respect. It's not about just, equal gender or gender equality. It's about understanding is that we all have a responsibility. Our responsibility is connected to this ontology, this value system. This is very new. This will be published. I decided and approached by Red Crow College because the thing is that this research, this knowledge, as our elders always passed down to us, The knowledge doesn't belong to me. It belongs to our community. It belongs to our kids. So I partner with Red Crow College, and we're going to publish it. So there'll be a booklet. And the booklet will be really focusing on how to use those values with each other and other genders, is understanding what these genders mean. Because when I speak about Christianity, it sexualized us. I grew up in my community. I didn't even know who I was. I mean, I knew I was Shaun from Moses Lake, for the most part. All these words, I didn't know what they were. I was a kid. But people in the community said stuff to me. I didn't even know what they meant. Apparently, I was supposed to be offended by them, but I didn't know what it meant. To be called names of something I didn't even know, right? I was a kid. I didn't even know about it yet. Seriously, I didn't know about it yet till I was older. The important thing is that we need to have this knowledge for our young people because they can understand that they fit somewhere. Because each of these specific ones had a specific role in the past. They had a role in our community. They did things for us. They did things selflessly. They didn't do things for themselves. They did it for us. And that was what was really important, what our gender roles are. Like, for the longest time, excuse me, elders, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I get really concerned that we put too much pressure on our women in our community, in a way. Like, you stay at home, cook, have kids, that's your role, sit back, be quiet. And I feel really bad. Because I grew up in a house where my aunt is like the ruler of all, right? That's the house I grew up in, my Aunt Eileen. She sits quiet. My Uncle Wallace gets out of hand. Wow. She'll hit him. And she'll scold him. And she says, I make the rules. Right? So I'm sure like our elder Barbara here, right? So it's important to understand those things, like how we connect each other, how we should respect each other, take care of each other, because each of us has specific roles. And I know our women aren't just there to make children, clean, and cook. They're powerful. They're powerful people because without them, we wouldn't be here. That's the truth. Like the real truth, right? And that's why this is important, to understanding these roles. None of us would exist. Having this conversation with my mom was quite interesting. When we talk about, I hear a lot of terms like we say, apistutuki, for example, a creator, right, in Blackfoot. So I was like, Mom, growing up, like with all those old people, there's like white feathers, Manik Mark Old Shoes, Sudaki, that Cecile Striped Wolf, like all these old people, was my sphere of influence as a kid. And you hear them praying, but I never heard them say apistutuki. Like, for some reason, I don't remember that. I remember Ichibatapiop, and they call the sun, the moon, etc., right? And I told her, am I crazy? Did I miss this somewhere, like apistutuki or something? I don't know why. For some reason, it's not in my head. And she said, no. Some people use it, some people don't. I remember what you're saying, because that's when they're praying, they're really focused on the source, right? Where we come from. And she said, I know what you're saying, I get it. She said, but as far as my mom, if you know my mom, sometimes some of the things she says, it's interesting. But she said, as far as I know, Nistunnan Akiks, Nistunnan, we're the creators. Because Kistowa, you wouldn't be bored. I had to respect that. I thought that's cool. For me, that I appreciate that. I accept that. That's an amazing way to look at it, right? That's an interesting way to see it. Because I want to be able to say that today. Why it's important that we have each other. Like, it's not about someone's more important than the next. One gender is more than the next. It's that shared responsibility we have with each other in our community. Our elders tell us all the time. That's what they pray for us to have. And I think sometimes we expect too much of them, right? It's up to us to make sure we interpret these things correctly so we can continue to share in that responsibility of passing on this knowledge with our elders as you learn it. Because that's important. That's part of our work and our responsibility. I wanted to go deeper into this, like to get to what all of these individuals did, but for the sake of time, I'm going to eventually wrap this up. It will be published at Red Crow College, I'm hoping by January, February, be available to public. So that way people have this opportunity to see where this comes from, all the sources I get it from, the recordings, because that's an important part of this work, is because I know this was a quick version of it, but it's understanding that I exist, but so do you. In my modern way of working in the city, working for government, in public, you're always asked, what is your pronoun? Right? It's like, why does it have to be a pronoun? How come it can't be like an adjective, like just call me like stunning, fabulous, whatever, right? It doesn't work like that. They want you to declare what your pronoun is, right? And I'm just like, well, just call me Akina. Because I've never in my life been able to say I'm a gay person because I grew up differently. I grew up only knowing who we are as Blackfoot. And for me, I couldn't say that. Two-spirit was a difficult term. I asked my Uncle Wallace, how do you say that? And he sat there just like trying to figure out how to put it in Blackfoot. I didn't tell him what it meant. I asked him, right? And so he's like, I don't know, it doesn't sound right. So what are you talking about? But he didn't understand what I was referring to. And that was in the 90s. But now it's just getting comfortable with this idea of Natsukapustomi, the story. Getting this idea, getting comfortable with what Awawaki is. Getting comfortable with Ninawaki. And understanding that these are real people in our community, our cousins, our family, our children, grandchildren, your aunt and uncle, sibling. They've been part of our lives for as long as you all remember. Lastly, I want to say is that I want to be able to say thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be in your presence. I appreciate that. And in that self, that's an honor. I never want to approach my people like I'm over and above them. I'm more educated than them. It's having an opportunity to address you. That is an honor itself. And I think that's an important way to be. Well, at least it is for me. I never want anybody to feel that I know more than them. And I'm still a learner today. And I encourage you all to learn more. Because this is stuff about us as being genders, about us being our identity, our language. Those connections is actually what makes our community stronger and powerful. And it's being able to not only, we can't ever go back to the past, we can't change things, but it's that we still have this knowledge with us. I'm very grateful to discover this because this is something I didn't expect. And these are just quick photos of these mannequins. And I want to kind of point out something. I had a conversation with one of the elders. And I know in the Horan Society there's very specific rules for when women can't do certain things, right? And I get it, and I respect it. I'm never going to try to tell them to change it. But I shared this story with him about running eagle. I told him, so no women have ever been like, themselves in there to be, no, that's not how it works. He was explaining it to me, right? I told him, what about running eagle? And he's looking at me, who's that? And I told him, well, she was this girl. She had her partner. She had the same, like a girl, a woman, a wife. She lived herself as like a man. And she's this person that actually waged kind of a whole bunch of warriors. She took about 1,000 of them and went south and pushed the Flathead out of our territory. Kept people out of our territory. And she's such a small woman, so fast. She was really powerful. And then she was the first woman ever inducted into the Warrior Society. I told him, I thought, isn't the worst side Horn Society? And he just stopped and looked at me. That's all he said. He said, that was it. I wasn't trying to cause anything, but I just asked. Because I think that's something significant. That at a time, they allowed this. Because that society wasn't about how much you have. It's about what you're doing for your people. Our elders sacrificed themselves throughout their lives, in our societies, for our people, right? This is what she was enacting. And I think that's actually really, really important and significant. There's multiple stories of her. There's multiple stories challenging even this. But she's a really significant, fierce person in our history. And I think that's really important, especially for our young women, to know how important that is. One other story is important to always remember is Akipiskan, women's buffalo jump. We always hear the story. I've heard the story of it. I always ask, well, how did those women get there on their own? Like, how did they duplicate, multiply, whatever? I could just never get the answer for it. So, but it's just curious, because I was really curious about learning this. So, I never got the answer. So I sat with a bunch of kids, this youth group I had. And so they asked a lot of questions. And I told them, you know what was interesting, because Napi was very foolish. Napi serves as a person of what you shouldn't do sometimes because of his behavior. But he was teaching us not to do certain things, right? And this instance of him trying to marry this tribe into this tribe of women is a really good story to think about. Is because the question to ask is that, how did those women come to be on their own? How did they duplicate without men? And I told the kids, remember that story they told us about the moon? Gokumikisum. She has these powers of creation. She's female, spirit. Don't remember these stories, because that's what binds us together. That's what makes us who we are. And I think these are really important kind of lessons. Like I said, I was doing a whole course on this, and having an afternoon to compact all of this is challenging. But I think it's important to understand there is more to it. There's more to our roles in gender. It's respecting each other, but it's giving ourselves room to be yourself, rather than putting all these expectations on you because of your gender. So at this time in my life, I realize is that had we been before we're colonized, what I do right now, being an educator, being a social worker, an advocate, I would be doing that in the past. I'm really fulfilling a role that I would have done in my community as one of these people. We all have a role. And it's not sexualized. I greet people with kindness. Don't even care what their gender is. The gender is irrelevant to me. It's respecting that person in the community because they're Nititapi, where I come from. Maybe a cousin, somebody I know, somebody's having an issue. In fact, even some that even had issues with me because of the way I talk, because of my mannerism, my long hair, the way I look. And I realize it's not even my issue, it's theirs. But I'll still respect them regardless. I'll treat them good and be kind. Gyan, thank you.